The second GOP debate was chaotic, a mess. Candidates talked over each other. The moderators didn't really have control. How did the second GOP debate end? Political analysts say just the way it began. Let me bring Daniel Cronrath, political science professor from FSCJ, into the fold here to give you the answer and see if he agrees with most of those political observers. Is the debate winner the candidate who wasn't even there?
Well, I think that appears so, Bruce. I mean, I think as you have talked about earlier in the segments today, the debate last night was extremely chaotic. The moderators quickly lost control of the debate just a few minutes in. I think one of the issues there is first of all, when you prepare a debate like this, all of the candidates are given instructions that they're supposed to adhere to while the debate is going on. However, if you're somebody who's lower polling, interrupting, trying to make it an issue about yourself is one way that you can kind of try to control the debate and frame the debate about issues that you want to talk about. So when you have three moderators who seem to be lacking the authority to basically jump in and stop that kind of conversation, you end up getting what just looked rowdy, chaotic, individuals starting topics that were not the initial question that was asked by the moderator, talking to each other in a very kind of like a childlike or a very school-like manner. And in the end, it really becomes unproductive because if you're a Republican primary voter actually wanting to know, is this somebody I would like to support other than former President Donald Trump, you really learn nothing. There may be some indications about the demeanor of the candidate, but outside of like core policy issues, there's not much there to actually gather.
So you agree that Donald Trump was really the winner and there was no need for him to show up like he argued?
I know it seems like conventional wisdom, but I think that the longer Donald Trump can continue to maintain large leads in the poll and not in polls and not have to participate in that kind of forum, I think the better off that is for Donald Trump. I will also say, despite the fact that there were calls last night for the first time to have Donald Trump on stage by members of his own party, do they really want that to happen? Does Governor DeSantis and Vivek Ramaswamy really want to try to take on Donald Trump in what is an environment which is naturally suited to his skill set? Recall how successful he was and how he emerged as a candidate because of his performance in the 2016 primary debates. So while they may make calls to see Donald Trump on that stage, is that really in the best interest of their campaigns?
I could give an answer, but I'm a journalist, so I can't on air. 7 candidates who did show up seem to have a lot of pent-up frustration, I think is the best way to put it. They, unlike during the first debate, let things show. Nikki Haley didn't hold back on Ramaswamy. In fact, she basically said, you know, the more I hear you talk, a little bit dumber I feel for what you say. Did we gain any more clarity where the GOP field is headed into the 24 election?
Bruce, I think the GOP field right now for president actually matches what's going on in the GOP in Washington, D.C. as well. You have two wings. You have a traditional wing of the Republican Party, which is really embodied by people like Senator Scott, Nikki Haley, Mike Pence, individuals who have a very, very traditional view of how Washington, D.C. operates. Then you have another wing of the party, perhaps some people refer to it colloquially as the MAGA wing, the individuals, for example, who are trying to shut down government, who are not the traditional Republicans in a Ronald Reagan mode. They're the individuals, for example, last night who have suggested we've given too much money to Ukraine. They're the individuals who are happy to shrink government spending and are calling out members of their own parties because even though they claim to be fiscally prudent, every time the Republicans get back control of Congress, they pass tax cuts, which just increases the debt and deficit. So you really, from a policy standpoint, you can see those divisions. But I think the other thing that stood out to me last night with the background and being taking place at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library in that setting, when you look back at Reagan, and I'm old enough now to remember Reagan, in my childhood, Ronald Reagan, for all of his politics, was an aspirational figure. He was positive. He found ways in debate forums to make people laugh. Who will ever forget the 1984 debate with Walter Mondale when he said, "I'm not going to hold my opponent's youth and inexperience against him in this debate"? Who in the Republican Party actually has that kind of aspirational figure? Who would we want in the Republican Party today going out and delivering a 1986 Challenger disaster speech to the United States when we lost the crew of the space shuttle and Reagan spoke about how they had slipped the surly bonds of Earth? That party today doesn't seem to be alive. It seems to be a party which is predicated on adversarial nature, fear. A lot of talk last night in the United States about what was wrong with the United States and not what was still right with the United States. And that seems to be a joint direction of both the traditional wing and the MAGA wing of the Republican Party.
And the Gipper's three-legged stool and what the Republican Party stood for back then doesn't seem to exist now either. Ron DeSantis, you know, those same analysts say that he gave an uneven performance at best. and that if he's going to go forward, he needs to score some touchdowns. Does he stand a chance?
Well, you know, I don't think that uneven is a good term to use. I do think there were moments last night when Governor DeSantis was able to accurately and quickly deliver pre-prepared text that you would go into a debate with. I thought he was clearly well prepared. But then there were also some major gaffes, you know, not inserting himself into the conversation until literally the 16th minute of the debate. You know, they placed Governor DeSantis in the center of the stage because...
Not ideal positioning.
Right. Second, you know, second in the field right now in the polls. And yet he didn't take any opportunities to try to break in early. And as we know, most individuals who turn into a debate are only really watching the first 18 to 20 minutes of debate. So not trying to inject himself earlier. And by the way, that's also a fault of the moderators. If you're going to position Governor DeSantis as the second in the polls at the center of the stage, why are you waiting so long to deliver a question to the highest polling individual on the stage? And that would be something the DeSantis campaign could make sure and guard against in future debates.
I'm almost out of time, but I've got to ask you, the governor said that Florida's crime rate is down 50%.
Sure.
That number isn't exactly accurate. All you have to do is look at the Marshall Project. We had 6 killings here in 6 days in Jacksonville.
Yeah.
Can we arrest ourselves away from crime, or is politics getting in the way?
I think that's the case. You know, I've had the pleasure of living in Jacksonville now for 20 years. And for 20 years, we've always had talks about trying to, understanding that we can't arrest our way out of a problem. And actually, I attribute the first time I heard that to Congressman Rutherford when he was the sheriff of Jacksonville. When the Jacksonville journey and the Payton administration was starting, and we were saying, you know what, really to get at the root of crime, we need generational investment. Yes, we need law and order, and we're going to give more money and more funding to the sheriff's office. But we need a generational investment into our communities to decrease this crime problem. And last night from the Republican folks running for president, all we heard was the same: law and order, lock them up. No kind of conversation about what the root of crime was in the United States. How do we solve these roots of crime on a long-term basis? It was just, you know, and every candidate, even Chris Christie, participated in that, you know, bragging about his record as a prosecutor and throwing people away in jail for as long a period of time. It was really an issue that I don't think that they addressed fully last night in a way which is going to get at the root of our crime problem.
Not fully and not honestly. We'll be right back.